Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blocking Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Gershom Gorenberg. Gershom, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Gershom Gorenberg. I'm a historian and journalist living in Jerusalem. I'm the author of 4 books, the latest of which is War of Shadows.
War of Shadows, I'm holding it up to the camera right now. Subtitle, Codebreakers, Spies, and the Secret Struggle to Drive the Nazis from the Middle East. The book came out earlier this year, and thank you for coming on to talk about it. It's a story. I mean, it's hard to describe this book. It's comprehensive. It's a story I knew very little about, and probably most Americans know very little about. So I actually was mentioning to a couple of people this when I was reading this book, and they're like, "What's it about?" I was like, "Well, it's about World War II and the Northern Africa and Middle East." And more than one person said, "Oh, like the English Patient," and I said, "Well, the actual guy is one of the people in here." But there's a cast of characters, and you have you have 8 pages. You have a cast of characters thing at the very beginning, sort of like dramatis personae, and it goes for 8 pages. So this is a huge work. It's quite an accomplishment. I mean, what would you say is sort of the one paragraph summary of this work, if that's possible?
The very brief version is that the Axis, led by Nazi German General Erwin Rommel, came within a millimeter of conquering all of the Middle East in 1942. That's a front which is almost completely unfamiliar to American readers. And the key to Rommel's advance and the key to his defeat was intelligence, breaking of codes. And the information on that remained secret for decades. What I've done in this book is to put together that story of how the battle for the Middle East went, and particularly how the outcome was determined by the work of Codebreakers and Spies. It could have very, very easily gone the other way.
Yes, and in a way I didn't understand before reading the book, you kind of see possible alternate disastrous histories for the world that could have possibly happened, or what the Axis powers intended for the Middle East. And so it's fascinating. And so you have, like I said, there's lots of characters. The chapters take place on at least 3 continents. I guess you talk about Japan also, so I guess that'd be 4. And is Israel? I guess Israel counts as part of Asia. So multiple continents, so many characters, and you did a lot of primary source original research and document archives. How did you put this together? Because you're reading sources from British intelligence, American intelligence, the German documents, Italian documents, Arab documents, I assume. How did you even
Hebrew documents as well?
Yes, Hebrew and Hungarian. Hungarian and Polish characters play major roles as well. How did you get your hands around all this?
It was putting together a 50,000 word jigsaw puzzle, a 50,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, except unlike a jigsaw puzzle, in this case, the pieces were mixed in with the pieces of other puzzles. So the first part is finding the pieces that belong to your puzzle and then fitting them together. The pieces were scattered between archives from here in Jerusalem all the way to California, with many, many places in between, particularly large amount of material in British archives. But besides that, also key material that never made it to the archives, that was still hiding in the attics or cupboards of key characters who I traced down in order to tell the stories. So I constantly was keeping track of the development of each of these pieces of the story. And the best days in this long hunt were when a document showed up that, took the whole story and went like this, changed what I thought had happened. And that also happened over and over again. There were days when I was, sitting in the British National Archive in London, and I'd suddenly see something, and I wanted to get up and scream, yes! Well, you don't do that in an archive. You don't do that in a British archive.
Yeah, that would be frowned upon.
So I would take a little picture of it and send a note to my wife and kids and say, look what I found today instead. So it was a constant process of putting together those pieces.
Mm-hmm. And so you're providing sort of, I guess, maybe a revisionist history of some major historical figures like Rommel, the German general, who, one of the maybe few people I had heard of or knew anything about before reading this. And then you are bringing sort of obscure, semi-obscure characters, historical characters like this man, Bonner Fellers, who we'll talk a little bit about. But also, I think you are digging out people from the archives who the historical record has never identified before in any way, like Margaret Story, a woman who worked at Bletchley Park, the code-breaking HQ in Britain. And I think, are you the first person to recognize her historical contribution?
I believe so. The whole time I was working on this, I knew that, just to put this in context, I knew that I was working on a spy story, and I knew that I was, in effect, also the detective in a detective story. I was trying to trace down who was the culprit and who discovered the culprit. In this case, the British Codebreakers in April of 1942 discovered, by breaking into German radio networks, that the Axis had an astoundingly high-level source in Cairo who was feeding Rommel the most essential secrets about British plans, supplies, positions, and then they had to find out who the source was. And I wanted to find out also who found it out, who was the person at Bletchley Park who was responsible for figuring this out. And in the course of my work, first I discovered a man named Russell Dudley Smith, who was in charge of the security of Allied of British and American codes. And then one day, looking through a handwritten set of notes in the British Archive, I discovered that there was this woman named Margaret Story, whose job it was. She was a young woman who was recruited by Bletchley Park in her early 20s and proved to be absolutely brilliant, and was given the job of going through decoded German messages to look for signs of Axis intelligence, to look for the echoes in German messages of British and American information. And that was one of the days when I discovered her. That was one of the days that I wanted to get up and shout. I mean, here is this completely unknown woman, totally forgotten by history, who played an absolutely crucial role at the critical moment that determined the outcome of the war in the Middle East, and obviously had an effect on the war as a whole. So following that lead, I managed to find the reports that she wrote in which she was analyzing these German messages and trying to figure out who was giving the Germans this information. I also went over those messages with somebody who has modern day experience with intelligence analysis to get a sense of how you would do this, to reconstruct Margaret Story's work. And that was amazingly exciting. But there was a problem, because there was very, very little information in the archives that told anything about who Margaret Story was. So then I went on a search for Margaret Story, and I guessed that she continued to work for the agency after the war. The agency moved to a certain small town in Britain. I contacted the local historical society there. They ran an ad that I wrote that said, anybody who knew Margaret Story, please get in touch with me. And the volunteer at the Historical Society also found her will for me, her last will and testament, because there's a national registry of wills in Britain, which gave me the name of her heirs because she died childless. So I had to find out. I mean, that told me people who was pretty likely knew her. So I managed to find 4 or 5 people in different places who had known her, and they constructed a picture for me of who she was. By the way, those people had no idea that she played this role. And even after the book came out, I got an email from a cousin of hers now living in Australia and said, I'm gobsmacked. We had no idea that this quiet woman who sometimes showed up at family gatherings played this role in history. So I admit I felt really, really good about taking this anonymous hero out of obscurity and giving her place in the history of World War II.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you identify there's a couple people like that who had played these decisive turning point kind of roles, and yet either they never they were forgotten by history, or they for various reasons the official story sort of played down their role, and maybe we can get into why that would be after the end of the war. And so I'm trying to think, I'm thinking about this conversation, how to sort of organize it. Would you say is there a protagonist to this book, or a main character, or sort of a anti-protagonist?
Well, the protagonist this is what's known in film jargon as an ensemble story.
Right.
That is to say, instead of there being one protagonist, there's a small group of protagonists. The real protagonists for me of the central story are the Codebreakers at Bletchley Park. And if I have to boil that group down further, actually the Codebreakers, because there was one member of that tiny ensemble who wasn't at Bletchley Park. That was a Polish codebreaker named Marian Ryuski, who was the original person who in a feat of absolute mathematical genius, originally broke the Enigma code in the early 1930s and passed on his information to the British shortly before the war began. And then there were several figures at Bletchley Park who continued that code breaking. One of them, of course, is famous now as Alan Turing, but was completely unknown for many years after the war. Another one who has remained, unfortunately, unknown was Turing's possibly main partner, a man named Gordon Welchman. And they did the work of day by day breaking the Germans' supposedly unbreakable Enigma code. And it wasn't a one-time thing. It's not like you broke the code book and then you could read it. The work had to be done day after day after day. And then I would say that the final 2 outstanding figures in this ensemble are the 2 people who, once it was discovered that the Germans had this source, had to figure out who the source was. And those people were Russell Dudley Smith and Margaret Story, who were even more forgotten by history than the Codebreakers. The antagonists here include Rommel, a figure who has been given much too much glory in history. Yes, the myth of Rommel deserves to be taken apart. Both the myth of military genius and even more so the myth of the good German. And it also, the antagonist ensemble also includes a figure in Axis intelligence who I won't say more about because I don't want to destroy the reading experience for anybody. But there was an Axis intelligence figure who may have been the most successful secret agent of the war, who was responsible for acquiring this source in Cairo.
Right, and if I think I know who you're talking about. But yeah, okay, sorry. Maybe we'll reveal that because obviously, this is sort of there are twists and turns in this book. But I think if we're talking about the same person, I googled this person's name. This person doesn't even have an English Wikipedia page. There's an Italian Wikipedia page, and that was it. But this certainly seems like another key player in World War II whose role is essentially unknown to experts or non-experts alike. But then, okay, so, but also part of this whole, I mean, what's interesting about this to me is like, and I think I read a interview with you prepping for this, that you discussed this, like from the American point of view, the part of the war that took place in Northern Africa and the Middle East is sort of a footnote or not. I don't know, a prelude to the things we were in the American memory, which is like D-Day and the campaign in the Pacific and like Band of Brothers and the sequel.
As my book editor put it when he read the manuscript, in American memory, the war goes Pearl Harbor, D-Day, we won.
Right. Okay, okay,
and that leaves out the fact that for 3 years of the war, the main front between the Western Allies and the Italians and Germans was in North Africa.
Yeah, and okay, so part of that is, again, this is and also I think in the American memory, it's thought of as a war in which the Allies are fighting the Axis powers of Germany and Japan. And then there's also Italy, which is also sort of, at least in like popular understanding, sort of a semi-footnote. Of course, we all know Mussolini. But the fact that the fascist Italy wanted to reconstitute a like modern Roman Empire, and that entailed controlling, Northern Africa and the Middle East. That's something I guess I don't know if I've ever like really heard that so explicitly. So can you talk a little bit about sort of like, the prelude to this stuff and why, how Italy's colonial efforts sort of set the stage for what happened during the war?
Yeah, and I'll do that with a sort of physical picture, because another one of the truly exciting days in this process was I spent time in Rome because I wanted to see the scenery where certain Axis intelligence people were working and where Mussolini was. And a wonderful historian of the fascist period took me for a walking tour around key parts of the city, and he took me to the square that Mussolini's balcony overlooks. Mussolini would stand out on this balcony and give his speeches to a entirely unspontaneous crowd, the people who were ordered to come there and cheer for him. And he explained the way that this square had been created as a fascist backdrop, because not only Mussolini spoke from a palace which had once been the Venetian embassy to the Vatican. So that's Venice, that was the great power of the Mediterranean in the Middle Ages. It faced the Italian tomb of the unknown soldier and a statue of the first king of United Italy. So that's Italy rising again. And then they smashed an avenue through the city so that from that square you could look directly to the Roman Colosseum. So that when Mussolini gave his speeches, you could turn and look at the Colosseum, and that's the glory of ancient Rome. And that is the mythical power that Mussolini was attempting to create for his regime, that he was rebuilding the glory of ancient Rome. And that meant that the goal was to create a new Roman Empire that would control the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East. And that's also what was behind his invasion of Greece, and the goal of taking control of Croatia, and the fact that almost immediately upon joining the war in June of 1940, he ordered the invasion of Egypt from the then Italian colony of Libya, setting off this massive struggle for control of Africa that went on for 3 years.
So there's both a sort of the fascist mythology and ideology compelled Mussolini and the Italians to want to hold this territory and settle colonists there, and I guess so sort of like expand Italian civilization, but also maybe like there's also the geographical and strategic part of why it was important to hold these various places, and maybe to Hitler that mattered more than the glory of Italian civilization.
Well, look, that meant, for instance, conquering the Suez Canal. That meant essentially smashing the keystone of the arch of the British Empire. The British Empire, the core of the British Empire stretched from Britain through Africa to India. And the keystone of that empire, even after Egypt's nominal independence, was Egypt, and Britain then controlled Palestine next to it. That was, by controlling that, they controlled the Suez Canal, which was the route to India. It was the route to Iraq, where there were oil fields. Nobody knew then that there was oil in Libya, but they certainly knew that there was oil in Iraq and Persia, as Iran was then called in the West. So conquering that territory was a key to resources, to control of the Suez Canal, and therefore breaking potentially the British hold on India as well. And there was the hope on the Axis side that by conquering the Middle East and reaching the Indian Ocean, they could actually link up with the Japanese via the Indian Ocean. Because unlike the Allies, where there was constant contact between the American and the British and exchange of resources, the Germans and Italians never had that kind of connection with Japan. They coordinated strategy to a certain extent, but they, oil from what was then the Dutch East Indies, today Indonesia, that was controlled by Japan, couldn't reach German tanks, for instance. So the hope was, the Axis hope was to break through in the Middle East and create this Axis connection all the way across the old world, which was fortunately foiled just barely in the final battles for Egypt.
Right. Okay. So at the outbreak of the war, Egypt is, well, what is it? Yeah. What is the status of Egypt in relation to the British? It's not like a formal colony. It's sort of a protectorate or something along those lines.
It had been a British protectorate officially until the 1920s, when it nominally received independence. And then there was a treaty between Britain and Egypt in 1936 that it supposedly expanded Egyptian independence. But the power behind the throne constantly in Egypt remained Britain. British influence was ubiquitous in Egypt. And there was a mutual defense pact between Egypt and Britain. And, the British security services operated there, and the British considered it very clearly part of their sphere of influence and a critical piece of territory to preserve. And just how critical is shown by a decision that was made by Winston Churchill, in the summer of 1940. Now, remember, we're talking summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, is pounding British cities and Royal Air Force bases in preparation for the expected German invasion of Britain. Britain stands alone in Europe against this immense German power. And nonetheless, in the midst of this situation, Churchill decided that reinforcements had to be sent to Egypt to hold on to Egypt in the face of the Italian invasion. That's how important Egypt was to Britain strategically.
And so Cairo, you just talk about Cairo a lot. Cairo sounds like a very interesting cosmopolitan place during this era, and there was various intrigues happening there. And so Egypt was ostensibly under the control of the king Farouk. Was that his name?
King Farouk, yeah.
So, and an interesting character, again, someone maybe I'd heard the name but knew essentially nothing about. And so, can you talk a little bit about him and why he was sort of, I guess he had ties to Italy, or maybe he was educated in Italy or something like that. So it wasn't, even though he was ostensibly an ally of the British, he was sort of, not, there were a lot of resentments also in the country because they didn't like, not everyone liked their colonial overseers, and so he was like this playboy, larger than life sort of guy.
Large is a good description of him, even physically. Farouk gained the throne of Egypt at the age of 16. His father, King Fuad, who was the first king of newly re-independent Egypt, the modern independent Egypt, had spent years in exile in Italy before returning to Egypt. So Farouk grew up with this Italian connection, and also with an immense resentment of the British because he wanted to be the power in Egypt, and the British presence got in his way. Was constantly hanging over him. He was brought up as a completely spoiled kid. I mean, his dad bought his first car for him to drive around the palace lands when he was 11 years old. When he took exams, he was given the answers in advance. He was an example of the nightmare of getting everything you want, and therefore never having the ability to get anything at all. Much of which came out in his extravagant lifestyle, his philandering, his gambling, his refusal to leave the gambling table until the other people lost to him. But running through this bizarre character is the constant theme of tension with the British. He also had a great amount of tension with the major elected political politician in Egypt, who was also very anti-British, but made the wise choice at the beginning of the war that the Axis was a greater danger than the British were. First, we have to defeat the Axis, and then we can take care of these colonizing Englishmen. So he was, Mustafa Nakhas was willing to work with the British to win the war, which meant we'll hold this little argument between us about you guys getting out of here in abeyance until the war is over.
Okay, that's interesting. So there's the position of the sort of the Arab states in this whole thing. They're sort of they're in one way it's sort of just like their geography and their strategic importance because of either resources or their geography related to Europe, makes them these sort of chess pieces or Risk, the board game Risk, just kind of moving things back and forth. And in some ways it seems like they didn't have a lot of agency. And then in other ways, some of the leaders were seeing which side they wanted to take, and some of the Arab leaders decided to fully embrace the Axis powers as a way, I guess, both to go against the colonial British Empire and also these pesky Zionists in mandatory Palestine who have their own ideas of what should happen there. And also there's another thing that I guess maybe isn't often emphasized. There were a number of Jews living in northern Africa at the time, and some hundreds of thousands or more, and and once the Axis powers invaded, their fate suddenly became much more precarious. So how does do you have any, can you comment on that aspect?
First of all, I want to say that you're comparing this to a game of Risk rather than a game of chess is a good comparison, especially a game of Risk with a number of players. Mm-hmm. There is a tendency when people talk about this to try to reduce it to two sides. But in fact, there's competition going on in all sorts of directions, intrigues upon intrigues, people who are playing multiple parts, sometimes more parts than they know because they don't know about the other intrigues. So the Arab leaders in various countries were in a position of political weakness vis-a-vis European powers, but they sat on territory that was incredibly important. You mentioned before how many continents this took place, this whole drama takes place in. Well, the Middle East is where Europe and Asia and Africa come together. You can't find more strategic territory, which may explain why then, as today, European powers may say they don't want to deal with the Middle East, but can never separate themselves from it. That's a theme which hasn't changed in the intervening 80 years. That the strategic importance is too much to let go of, and then you have to deal with local leaders. So the British, in particular, are in this position where they want to keep Arab leaders on their side, where there are a couple of Arab leaders who are clearly pro-Axis, but others who are either sitting on the fence or favor the Allies. They want to maintain the support of the 500,000 Jews in Palestine, but not give those Jews any concessions whatsoever because they're afraid of the Arabs. All of these are parts of that game of risk that you're talking about. And then, in addition to that, as you mentioned, all the way across North Africa and the Middle East, there were Jewish populations. There were 75,000 Jews in Egypt. There were 30,000 Jews in Libya. There were, of course, 500,000 Jews or more in Palestine. There were Jews in Syria and Iraq and Persia. And the Axis posed a tremendous threat to all of them. And this comes to its extreme at the moment that Rommel invaded Egypt, because in June 1942, when Rommel came virtually to the gates of Alexandria, crossed most of Egypt and was very close to conquering the major cities along the Nile of Egypt, because at that moment, the SS in Berlin, confident of Rommel's victory, created an Einsatzkommando, a mobile killing unit that was assigned to Egypt and the Middle East, whose job it was to murder all of the Jews of the Middle East. And the man who was put in charge of this unit, Walter Rauff, had previously been responsible for the mass production of the mobile gas vans that were used to kill 500,000 Jews in Europe. So the plans and the preparations for carrying out genocide in the Middle East were very, very much part of this story. And once again, it's only this very, very narrow victory of the British Army in Egypt that prevented that from happening.
So if there's a main... I was sort of thinking... the anti-protagonist, or would you call him an antagonist? I don't know. Obviously, he was a Nazi, Rommel, and this is sort of. I mean, you could say he's the main character in somewhat respect, or at least one of the main themes of the book is debunking a myth of Rommel as both the ultimate strategist, is that a word? Strategist, I guess is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
The genius of desert warfare, the Desert Fox, and, who had, some supernatural almost ability to, succeed. And also, I guess, this idea that, well, he was sort of, was it War Without Hate? Was that a phrase that was used? It was like,
he wrote a memoir that...
He wasn't committed to the Nazi project in the way that some of these other Nazis were. He was more like just a good German who was serving his, doing the job he was meant to do, and he was really great at it. And I guess, so that is sort of maybe I feel like maybe this maybe more like 30 or 40 years ago, this would have been the idea of Rommel. But can you talk about what we know more about Rommel now?
Well, that may, despite certain efforts to take Rommel off his pedestal, that remains a very, very popular image of Rommel, the military genius and the general who intended to serve his country but wasn't a Nazi. So let's first talk about the military genius part. Yeah, and for this, I'll give you a metaphor. Imagine you're sitting in this casino watching or sitting in a card hall, and you're watching this game of poker, And this guy wins 3, 4, 5 hands of poker that seems to like totally defy the odds. And you're saying he's a genius. The other thing that's happening very often is he thinks he's a genius and he thinks the odds don't apply to him. In fact, he's been very, very lucky, but the odds eventually catch up with him. And that kind of compulsive gambler who wins and then thinks the odds don't apply to him, that's a good picture of Rommel. Rommel had a serious disregard for a crucial issue of warfare, which was supplies, logistics, an issue which was even more important in North Africa than elsewhere, because you're talking about desolate land where even the water has to be brought forward by truck to the soldiers. And yet several of his gambles succeeded, which gave him this great confidence and made people around him think that he was an incredible genius. In the final part of his advance in North Africa, he had one more advantage. In a sense, the cards were marked. He was reading the plans of the other side. He was getting this amazing intelligence starting no later than December 1941. For at least 6 months, the secrets of British General Headquarters Middle East were flowing directly to him, which obviously in war as in cards, being able to read the other side's intentions and strengths is a tremendous advantage. So the picture of his genius has been inflated. But besides that, he was a man who worshipped Hitler and expressed that adulation in letters that he wrote to his wife. He was the German general in Libya at a time that the Italians were beginning to send Jews to a concentration camp in Western Libya.
That was a fact I had never heard before, or if it was told to me, I had forgotten it, that was it Italy was running a concentration camp for Jews in Libya, and this wasn't a death camp, but this was more a literal getting everyone together, and then like many of them died of like preventable diseases and starvation.
Right. They on the one hand, they didn't have a program of killing the Jews there, but on the other hand, when the Jews in this camp complained about the fact that they had nothing to eat, the commandant told them, "We didn't bring you here to keep you alive. It's just cheaper to starve you than to shoot you." And brutal methods were being used to put down resistance. Classic brutal methods were being used to put down resistance in Libya. And Rommel was complicit in all of this. And at the point when the SS created this mobile killing squad and sent its commander to El Alamein in the Egyptian desert to meet with Rommel's staff, the reason he was told that he couldn't go into action yet was not that Rommel objected to this, but simply, we're stuck here. We don't have the supplies and the trucks to take you forward yet. So wait in Athens, and as soon as we win here, you can go into action. Fortunately, Rommel lost there, and that didn't happen. But there's no sign that Rommel had any problems with the Nazi plans. Yet, when he left North Africa, let's note, after he was defeated in North Africa, he wrote this memoir called War Without Hate. And that became a slogan that was used to describe the war in North Africa. It was only a war without hate if you ignore the presence of civilians there. If you act as if North Africa is an ocean and you just have fighting ships fighting each other. But that wasn't the case. The town of Benghazi in Libya changed hands 5 times during the war. Okay, other towns in Libya were destroyed by bombing. The Jews of Libya were sent to a concentration camp. Cairo and Alexandria were bombed. There were millions of people across the Middle East whose fate was going to be affected by who won in these battles. And the idea of a war without hate treats all of those people as if they were invisible or less. And I think that we're at a stage in the way that we look at history that it's really, really important to not to go along with that erasing of the effect of this war on the people who actually lived in Africa and in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. So Rommel wrote his memoir after leaving the Middle East, but the war was still going on. So I mean, at least we can say this about Rommel. He's sort of an energetic character with lots of, so his, the sort of bursting ahead in the tanks, going far ahead of the supply line was one of his techniques. But also he had enough time while the war was still going on. I guess he was ostensibly still a commanding general on the Western Front, or explain this to me, because I didn't even know that he didn't outlive the war, and that he took cyanide. Is that what ultimately happened to him? Or he was offered either we're going to kill you or you take cyanide, because of they thought maybe he was involved in the anti-Hitler assassination plot, but actually he probably wasn't.
He first of all, his army was defeated in North Africa in May of 1943. He escaped. He returned to German-controlled territory in Europe. Very soon after that, the Allies invaded Sicily, and then in September of 1943, the Italian mainland. And the next big assignment that Rommel was given was putting together the German occupation of Italy, to prevent it from falling into Axis hands, which turned all of Italy into a battleground.
Right. So Italy capitulated, right, to the Allies, but then Germany declared war on Italy or invaded Italy.
Germany occupied Italy immediately after the capitulation, set up a puppet regime under Mussolini, who is now completely controlled by Berlin, and the Allies, had to push their way north through Italy. In fact, Rome was liberated by American forces the day before D-Day. Another piece of the war that gets sort of erased in American memory, because D-Day came the next day, so all the headlines switched. But in fact, this was the first Axis capital to fall to Allied forces. It was a huge event. Roosevelt gave a radio speech, 1 down, 2 to go, right? And then, the next day sort of overshadowed that. So Rommel was in charge of the German troops who occupied Italy. And then after that, he was assigned to the defense of the Atlantic coast against the expected Allied invasion of France. Excuse me for a second.
Sure.
And very soon after that invasion, his strategy for defending the coast, fortunately, was unsuccessful. He was wounded when an Allied airplane shot up his command car, and he was back at his home resting when the attempted coup against Hitler took place. One of the people who was questioned after that coup by the Gestapo named Rommel as a member of the conspiracy. Secret policemen showed up at Rommel's house, and they told him that he had a choice of committing suicide or of being put on trial. The apparent reason that he was given this choice, unlike other people involved, was that he had been turned into a propaganda figure by the Nazi regime. So it would have been a loss for them as well to say that he was a traitor. They wanted to preserve his image as well. So it said, look, you're going to be dead. You can, take cyanide, and your wife will get her pension, and your memory will still be heroic, or you can refuse, in which case we're going to arrest you and you're going to get killed anyway. So he took the suicide choice and died in the summer of 1944. And that, whether he was involved in the conspiracy or not, that's not, that wasn't an essential subject for me. But I can tell you that among German historians, there's a serious debate about whether he was actually involved or whether somebody just, spouted names.
Mm-hmm.
But his supposed involvement in that coup, the way that he died at the hands of the Nazi regime, helped to create this myth of him having been a good German after the war.
Mm-hmm. So is another part of this myth of Rommel related to Bonner's Feller? Is that his name, or is it Bonner Fellers?
Bonner Fellers.
Bonner Fellers.
Okay.
And the story they wanted to the Allies wanted to tell after the victory, maybe obscuring what actually happened with this man Bonner Fellers.
Well, I'm not sure if that's the thing that they were most interested in obscuring. The thing that the British made the most explicit point of covering up, of keeping secret at the end of the war, was this tremendous code-breaking feat of breaking the Germans' Enigma code. And there is a very explicit order, which I found in the British archives, explaining why everybody who knew the secret had to keep the secret for the rest of their life. In other words, those people, the small number of people who knew the secret, might have felt the war's over, we can talk about it. So a very explicit order went out in April 1945 on the eve of VE Day, in which they were told, you may never speak about this. You must carry the secret for the rest of your lives. And the top reason that was given was that the Germans have to believe that their defeat was entirely on the field of battle by superior arms. Because otherwise, as happened after World War I, they might try again. Right? Remember, this is only, the leaders of the Allies now are people who were young men at the end of World War I. It's just a few years earlier. So the Germans tried another time, and they were afraid the Germans would try a third time, and they didn't want to give them any psychological encouragement by letting them know that, oh, gee, our intelligence helped us win the war. So this order was given that this had to remain a secret. It eventually came out in the 70s in a very distorted form, and it's taken many years in the release of top secret documents to be able to create a better picture of what actually happened. And then it was
because like sort of intelligence work and the decoding was maybe seen as sort of an underhanded, ungentlemanly sort of way to win victory versus the just combat on the field of battle. And so that would possibly be a parallel to the stab in the back myth that helped fuel the rise of Nazism.
It might be seen as a parallel to the stab in the back myth. It might be seen as, it was because of this intelligence screw up and not because we are inherently weaker than the combined strength of Britain and America that we lost this war. So let's, do a better job of designing our codes and go for it again. That was the fear in April, May of 1945. There was another side of the intelligence business which involved what could be called America's overt spy in Cairo, and that was Colonel Bonner Fellers. Colonel Bonner Fellers was the U.S.
So his first name was Bonner. His last name was Fellers, and he was the military attaché in Cairo for the U.S. military.
Yeah, he was sent there immediately after the Italians first invaded Egypt in 1940. It was an almost impetuous decision by the War Department in Washington. Oh my gosh, we've got to send somebody to the Middle East to see what's going on there. And he ended up being the American representative on the active front where the British were fighting the Italians and then also the Germans, and where they were trying out American weapons. Right, America was, American factories were turning out new weapons which were being sent to Egypt for the battle. And Bonner Fellers was there to report on everything and to tell Washington what worked and what didn't work and what British tactics were unsuccessful. He was no lover of the British, so his cables were full of criticism of how the British were fighting the war, something which didn't, took a large amount of chutzpah, since no American soldiers were at that time fighting the Germans.
Right. So this was, before Pearl Harbor and before America entered the war, but the Lend-Lease Act or agreement was such that American, armor material, whatever, was being sent to Britain for use, and a lot of it was being sent to the Northern Africa, Middle East theater.
Right. American tanks, Trucks, you may think trucks are important, but again, that supply lines are critical in a battle like this. Airplanes, all these things were being, guns were all being sent to Egypt to supply the British in this battle. And the man on the ground who can tell you, hey, you know what? The air filters on our airplanes are not built to deal with sand. And they won't work in the desert. You know, these tanks can't stand up to desert conditions. We've got to make alterations in our tanks. But gee, it looks like the armor plating is good, and you can't fight the way the British did because they're making. Oh, by the way, you know, it's important to have markings of whose tank is whose on the top of the tank, because otherwise, when you fly your airplanes over the battlefield, they can't tell who's our tanks and who's their tanks. All of these pieces of information Bonnerfeller is sending from Cairo. And the British have a weird relationship with him because on the one hand, they're getting hints that he's just dissing them all over the place, saying that they're amateurs and they don't know what they're doing, which, as I said, was sort of insulting because the Americans weren't yet fighting the Germans. And on the other hand, he seemed to have an astounding, an uncanny ability to get British officers to tell him things. And you know, he complains at one point, I don't really have an official status that will get people to talk to me. And yet you look at his cables and they're full of the most amazing top secret information. The cables, by the way, the major source I found of the cables was that he had taken home the originals, and there were copies of them in the attic of his post-war house in Washington, D.C. I tracked down his granddaughter. It took a few months to do that, and I managed to get her on the phone. I said, "Do you have any material from your grandfather?" She said, "Gee, there's some envelopes in the attic. I'll check that out." And it turned out that they were the cables from Cairo.
That's wild.
Told all of his contained all of his reports from there. So in a sense, he was an American quite out in the open, spying on the British. And there's more to that story, but again, I'll leave that to the readers as they pursue the mystery through the book.
Okay, yeah, we won't reveal that. Although you do talk about his career after the war, which has some twists and turns, which are in a way surprising, but also like he became involved in Jubilee politics and the John Birch Society and other sort of unusual things. Yeah, so definitely another character who I never heard his name before reading the book, but he will play this very strange key role in the whole thing. Okay,
he was one of the people before he was sent to Egypt. He was one of the last people in America. I'm sorry, right before he was sent to Spain and then to Egypt. One of his last meetings in America was with Charles Lindbergh. Until he left the United States, he was a dedicated, extreme isolationist. When he got to Egypt and he saw the war, and for the first time in his military career, after over 20 years in the military, he was actually seeing the battlefield. He became a big proponent of American involvement, which lasted through the war. And post-war, he astoundingly reverted completely to his extreme right-wing isolationist opinions, and for years ran a lobbying group against foreign aid. and as you said, became a supporter of the John Birch Society. Really, really fascinating character.
Yeah. Okay, so let's mention this person who I alluded to earlier. So Laszlo Almazy, or I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. Can you talk about this figure who, as maybe people know him through his fictionalization in The English Patient book and movie?
Right. So Almazy was a Hungarian explorer. As you said, there's a highly fictionalized version of him that appears in The English Patient. In fact, he actually did go from Hungary to Egypt and become one of the two top explorers of the virtually unknown country of the Libyan desert, of the Great Desert west of the Nile River. And then when the war started, he returned to Hungary, eventually was seconded by the Hungarian army to the German army, and was sent to North Africa. And his goals included smuggling German spies into Cairo. And one of his most spectacular cross-desert journeys was, in fact, successfully smuggling 2 German spies into Cairo. Their story has also been told in a number of books, some of which claim to be nonfiction. A whole myth was created around them. The actual story of their capture remained secret for over 60 years in the files of MI5, the British counterintelligence agency. And those files tell a completely different story than the myth of the spies that Almasi brought into Egypt.
Yeah, so I was not familiar. So I had never read or seen The English Patient, but of course knew it as being a huge thing. And so Ray Fiennes is the very fictionalized version of this real life historical figure in the movie. And yeah, I didn't know the story of these 2 German spies who I guess after the war wrote memoirs or something and told their own version of this that made them seem like they had more influence than probably they did in real life, or much more influence than they did in real life. And yeah, so how is that?
They show up in The English Patient.
Okay.
The British major who claimed to have caught them, I underline the word claimed, shows up in The English Patient. Obviously Almasi does. All of these accounts, the fictionalized accounts, were based on these post-war stories that were published, which included a memoir by one of the spies, a memoir by the British major who claimed to have captured them. Here and there in those stories, they occasionally accidentally run into historical fact.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly, as you describe it, they sort of had. It seemed like they had a fun time for themselves, in Cairo during the war, and but their effectiveness in aiding the German, war effort, it seems to be basically nil. But okay, so another sort of theme, or a minor theme in the book, seems to me like you're also sort of doing some revisionist history on the Israeli or Zionist narrative of World War II, and so. What was the role? It's super complicated, and I basically didn't know almost any of this story about the Jews who were living in Palestine. Some of them wanted to enlist in the British Army to fight, and then there were sort of militias that were trained and stuff because they thought that, and there was some bombing of like Haifa and other areas during the war, but they thought that if Rommel succeeded, he's gonna come into Palestine, and then so you needed like a defense force in addition to the Australians and other New Zealanders who were being brought in as part of the British Army, and so you have some there are men who became major figures in Israel like Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Rabin have small cameos in this as what they were doing during the war, but I guess maybe in Israel there's more of a myth making about what was happening during this time.
So, for a period of 2 years, there was an ever-present danger of the Nazis reaching Palestine. Now, the Jews in Palestine did not yet know fully what that meant because nobody had a clear picture of what was going on in Eastern Europe. In fact, when the first reports came out of mass murder, for instance, I found an editorial in a Hebrew newspaper from Tel Aviv saying, people shouldn't be reporting this stuff. It's obviously an exaggeration and it just causes panic. So they didn't know precisely what it meant, but they knew that Nazis were bad news and that it would be bad to fall into German hands. So even though by 1939, the Jewish community in Palestine really wanted to see the British go, the vast majority of people, all but a really handful of people, decided, look, we have to work with the British to defeat the Nazis before we can turn to getting rid of the British. sort of parallel here to what was going on in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Egyptians and the Israelis may have fought afterwards, but they had the same attitude at the time. Let's get rid of the Nazis, and then we can fight each other, without that hanging over our head.
Right, and there's also a parallel because both Nasser and Sadat make cameo appearances as young men in the Egyptian military, playing small roles during the story you tell. So it is, yeah.
Yes.
It's almost amazing. Like a prequel. Like it's like. Do you think this book's possible?
It's definitely the prequel to the
prequel to 1948.
It's the prequel to 1948. It's really the prequel to the whole Arab-Israeli conflict. Is what happened during World War II, which I describe in War of Shadows. In Palestine, the big debate in the Jewish community was: should we create our, should our young people sign up for our own underground forces, which will be here to deal with the Germans, even if only as partisan groups, if the Germans invade, or should we join the British Army? The mainstream opinion was that the overwhelming number joined the British Army, and there was a very powerful campaign in the Jewish community to join the British military. Sometimes much more than the British themselves wanted, because they were a little bit worried about training these Jews how to use guns. But the smaller number created these undergrounds, including what became very famous afterwards, the Palmach, which was what the young Yitzhak Rabin belonged to, for instance, the young Moshe Dayan originally belonged to. And Israeli mythology puts a great stress on those undergrounds because later, in 1948, they were the core of what became the Israeli army. During the war itself, they played an incredibly minor role, if any. One of the British secret agencies, something known as the Special Operations Executive, which was responsible for training resistance movements, actually helped train the Palmach. One 90-year-old ex-Palmach man explained to me how in the SOE camp he learned how to make a time delay fuse, for instance, to blow things up, something that post-war he used to blow up a British radar station. But they never actually went into action because the Germans did not reach Palestine. So in that sense, the mythology puts a great stress on a group which played a incredibly marginal role. The reality is that the borders of the Holocaust were set by where Allied armies stopped the Nazis. And that can be said to be on three fronts. The British managed to prevent a German invasion of Britain, therefore Britain was a refuge. Where the Soviet army eventually stopped the German army in Russia, that's the line between genocide and safety. And in North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein, where the Germans were stopped in Egypt, was the outer limit of German power, and that battle is what prevented a Holocaust in the Middle East. It was soldiers from South Africa and India and Britain and Australia and New Zealand and elsewhere who stopped that German invasion and prevented a Holocaust in the Middle East. In fact, after the book came out, I got a letter from a man whose father had extremely moving email from a man whose father had been in the New Zealand 2nd Division in the Middle East. And he said, this is the first that we've known that, you've given a different meaning to my father's, battles, that they prevented this genocide, which really, really touched me to get that note. What is true is that the decision of the Jews in Palestine to fight on the British side meant that somewhere in the area of 25 to 30,000 Palestinian Jews received military training and experience during the war. And on the other hand, the political forces, especially within the Egyptian army, especially from young men like Sadat and Nasser, against fighting on the Allied side meant that the Egyptian army finished the war with virtually no battlefield experience. And in 1948, if you look at Nasser's own writings about the 1948 war and the writings of other young officers like him, when they invaded Palestine in May of 1948, they thought, we're trained soldiers with a real army, and we're just fighting these gangs, they called them, of Zionists. And they were defeated. And what happened was, a large part of what happened there was, the amateurs turned out to be the Egyptians. They had no war experience. They had not had the brutal training, the brutal schooling of World War II. And those Jews in Palestine were much more prepared to fight a real war. So in that sense, again, this was what happened during the war was the prequel to the entire development of the Arab-Israeli conflict afterwards. And I think that without seeing what happened between 1940 and 1945, particularly between 1940 and 1943 in the Middle East, you really can't understand what happened afterwards.
Yeah, that was a very interesting conclusion of yours that I had never heard before. And yeah, the fact that, I guess Egypt essentially outsourced its, they're like, well, the British will just do this for us, and King Farouk was sort of trying to play both sides or something, but also spending time romancing women and gambling and stuff. So it was, they were sort of in a way sat out, and because the Nazi push was stopped at El Alamein, the Egyptian military was never truly tested, and as you note, the mobile killing vehicles were like ready to go, led by this German guy who eventually escaped to South America and lived out his life and was never captured or prosecuted. Is that his name? Ruf?
Walter Rauff.
Okay, so if things had gone differently, the world the world would be different in many ways, but one of them would be many more Jews would have been killed in the Holocaust, or a second Holocaust would have happened in the Middle East. So we've mentioned a lot of things that have gone up that you talk about in this book. I feel like there's you can have a whole another conversation on different topics. Like I said, there's a lot here. It really is sort of a comprehensive look at a part that in American culture is elided or semi-forgotten. Is there anything? Maybe we should start wrapping things up. Is there anything else you want to say about the book? I feel like we've given enough that people who are interested in this will want to check it out.
Well, what I'd like to say is we've talked about a lot of different subjects here, but the core of this book is a story about people. It's a spy story. It's a story about the mystery of who was supplying the Axis with their information and the search for that source. And if you are interested in the Middle East, but also simply if you're interested in a mystery and a spy story, this is one which happens to be true. It's every detail here is attested to by the sources, and the story is told according to those sources, but it's a real story of how spying changed the outcome of the war, changed the lives of millions of people, and then the secret was buried. And what I've tried to do is bring that story to the surface and to give the heroes of that story their proper due. And I hope people enjoy reading it.
That's a good place to end it. Yeah. So check it out. War of Shadows. Once again, you will, I guarantee you will learn things you didn't know before about World War II, even if you are a history buff or something like that, from this book, because like we mentioned, you uncover the biographies and actions of people who are totally forgotten by history. Okay, Gershom, thank you for coming on. Thanks for the book. You do you want to anything else you want to mention? Your Twitter or website or anything like that?
Oh, you can find me on Twitter at Gershom Gershomg, and the book War of Shadows is available in all the usual websites.
Yes, wherever fine books are sold, and I'm on Twitter at REACW, ARYEHCW. And okay, so thank you, Gershom. Thank you to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.